Everyone. Today I'm joined by Han, one of the co-founders of Mintlify. I'm super excited to be talking to him today about APIs, developer experience, docs, SDKs, and everything in between. Um,
Yeah.
just to kick things off, yeah, I want to let Han introduce himself.
Thank you so much. Like it's a real pleasure to be here. Should I go into a bit of an intro or?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, of course. My Han, I am one of the co-founders of Mintlify, and we at Mintlify we build really beautiful and high converting documentation for startups to large enterprises alike. Okay,
Love
awesome.
to,
Sorry.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about
Yeah,
Mintlify's founding story and how you got
of
started.
course. Thank you. Yeah. So, basically, Hanvi and I, who's my co-founder, we met during college, building tons of products together. We've both been like developers for most of our lives, and not only that, I think our approach to building and learning stuff has always just been like kind of just working to on projects and like throwing it out and and
Hmm.
seeing if anyone uses it. And a lot of that process was just like like going and figuring out how new technologies work, how to, even build an app in the first place. Um, and so when we kind of got together and built a lot of these cool projects together, um, we felt that there was a very strong kind of like, um, passion that we had towards building products for other developers to go and like learn how to build great products because that's like our experience with figuring out how to build products ourselves and how we got to be the type of people that we are. Um, and so when eventually it kind of came to turn, after building a previous startup in the past, we and like knowing that we this is what we want to do out of college, we kind of just got together and we're like, hey, let's like go and build towards these group of people that we really love. And for us, it was developers, and specifically on helping how can we get them to like build better products, use better technologies, and so forth. It became very natural for us to kind of like swim in this space. As it relates to docs, to be honest, it was not our first idea.
Yeah,
uh,
as it is.
we pivoted like 8 times until we landed on this. But in hindsight, it seemed like the most obvious idea, right? But I suppose that's always the case. But it was not the first. But interestingly enough, if you were to take all of those ideas that we tried, like they were all in the similar space. And I actually think if you were to look in hindsight, but it doesn't seem obvious when you were going through it, is that they all eventually map and eventually like kind of
Mm.
got us to the product that we're building today.
That's awesome to hear. I really resonate with the idea that, what you're building is not just docs, right? It's really helping developers learn and understand and communicate. Um, I think that's so fantastic to hear, especially in the space where you have other docs products. I'm kind of curious to get your take of how you see Mentalify in the market today when there are other documentation options out there.
Yeah. I mean, where do I start? Uh, I think I would say that I think, um, in my opinion, there's a time and space and a type of company that would, use a provider like ours versus, of course, ultimately choosing to build it in-house, which is also a very common, situation. Um, I think there's a approach that we're taking right now, which is to frankly strike kind of like this middle ground approach
Mm.
of like being very developer forward, being very developer oriented, but also like really getting up to the quality of like the kind of the great doc experience that you would hear from these great companies who then like spent tons of money and engineers to go build it themselves, but achieve that in like a much more faster, intuitive, and like simpler way. And so I think for us, it's kind of really about balancing that kind of like, developer orientedness of it, having this great user experience for the developers to go build and update the stocks without being like too much of a lift that requires them to move heaven and earth just to make this stuff happen. Um, and I think for us also at like, mentioned, really obsessing on like the end user experience. How do we make that really good? And being like this team that can almost work with other companies to be like their docs team as an extension of their company, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of something that we think about at Speakeasy, which is in the world of SDKs and making API calls, like time to 200, right, is
Yeah.
something we like to talk about. Is like how quickly can a developer get to that first successful experience? And in your case, it might be successfully understanding an API, using it. In our case, might be implementing an SDK into an app and
Yeah.
having a successful request go through. I think it's such an important point of developer experience, and what makes like the hallmark of a great DevX is that
Yeah.
initial, as you said, like really high quality end user experience.
Yeah. And
Um,
as quickly as possible too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What have you seen with companies that that Mintlify works with? How has starting to use Mintlify and like prioritizing developer experience, what kind of
Yeah.
impact has that had on businesses that you work with?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I
Sorry, big
mean
question.
yeah, it's very big question. I think it's as good as like the hallmarks of having a great product, right? Like I think I think I couldn't agree more with what you just said about like developer experience being about like the first to 200. It's so much about how do you get them set up to achieve what they're looking to do as quickly as possible, right? And like for them to really kind of get to what they're trying to achieve, right? Like I think that the way that I look at this, like developer experience is nothing like having great developer experience is oftentimes nothing more than just like how can we help achieve like what the developer is asking for as absolutely quickly as is possible, but getting to really what they need as comprehensively as possible, right? And so it's like I think having great versions of that, just is a great product in the sense that it's like, it's great for conversion, it's getting great for, getting things set up for the company and also for them to realize the value of also like the product and what you're building, and ideally as quickly as possible. So, and the list really goes on, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. One more point on developer experience I'm curious to get your take on is it sounds like there is a lot of still build versus buy decisions that people have to go through, right, when they
Yeah.
start using a product like Mendelify.
Yeah.
What, do you ever run into people who are hesitant to outsource this? And if so, like what are some of the things that give them pause when
Yeah.
when for those who do have objections?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the first thing I think like is that I think there is completely room for the build versus buy argument to be valid in every case and for like really like the tremendous amount of of developer tooling products, right? I think there's always that argument. The way that we look at this is really about how much of this whole spectrum can we do our best in really serving so that it's ultimately all about like making this this choice like like go of going with us better
Mm.
than to like to build it themselves and build it in house. I genuinely have this opinion that like some of the really great docs out there are obviously built to be are built in house. But I also think that the reasoning for that is not so much as a derivative of like it specifically because they're building in a house, but because by building in a house, it allows them to have like this great customizability, this great
Mm.
personalization, and like to really achieve this like really ideal outcome of what they're looking for that they couldn't otherwise with a platform or like more of a more general vendor, right? And our opinion is that like we actually believe that there is like a lot of that and increasingly more so in the future that could actually be achieved by using a better like using a vendor. And so for our job is to work with the companies who who first of all might not need that like extreme customizations now, but then ultimately build the product so that it's better over time, more customizable over time, it's easier to use over time, so that in the long run, like there really isn't just much of a reason to think that, fully building in house is better. And so to me, it's really about kind of like what we can do now and then ultimately how can we grow into being a bit better.
Totally agree with that. Um, Before turning to APIs, which is my favorite topic, of course,
Chris.
if if you had to name, one or two companies out there that you really admire the developer experience of, as a maybe as a
Yeah.
user or even just as an observer, who, which of those companies that come to mind?
Yeah. I mean, obviously Speakeasy.
I'll
Of
strike that one, but
course.
if there's other companies that stand out to you.
Yeah. I really, I'm not too fancy here. I think of the big ones, right? Like, I think Stripe as a great embodiment of
Of course.
incredible developer experience through and through in every aspect of this. Um, and also, I personally am a big fan of Vercel, because I think there's a tremendous amount of craftsmanship that they really put into, the developer experience that really raised the bar for like how easy it is to set them things up, how performant things should be, but ultimately like how easy it is to get from nothing to a functional app live in production in just a matter of minutes. And so I think I personally, for both these companies, really look up to them and how we build our company as well.
So I can tell you likewise, the number of times the Mintlify homepage and home and their onboarding experiences shown up in our internal discussions is I can't count. I've lost count. It just says also speaks to I think how well you guys have invested on that side and really set the bar as well.
Oh, thank you.
Um, so turning to APIs, at Speakeasy, we spend so much time um, thinking about APIs, looking at people's API specs, everything in between, and we've realized that the API reference often ends up being this ugly stepsister of the documentation. It's often hosted a separate URL. Sometimes we see
Yeah.
people with like a doc site and an API reference site. Um, what is
Yeah.
your ideal relationship between the API ref and the broader documentation?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I personally think they should be combined into one unified experience, for a bunch of reasons, right? Like, I think it's obviously more consistent for the end user when they're browsing, the product to have like the documentation and also like the API references better synced together, you know, having better navigation, having better like cross-referenceability. Is like, I mean, really to me, like the ideal state, right? Um, Consistency for branding, another part of it, but it's often a huge challenge, right? Because like, I think it's funny because we see that similarly as ourselves. Like, some people would use like one doc site for just like their guides and the SDKs and how to get things set up, but then like a completely different thing for API references. Um, and I think we try to do our best job to try to unify that as much as possible. And
Yeah.
we found it to be quite a powerful selling point for ourselves to work with these companies that are always been looking to get these things together. Um, and so I think companies want to have it be together. I think it is objectively better for them to be together. It's just often as a byproduct of not really being able to, because an option that's really good for building guides might not necessarily be the same for building API references, and kind of trying to be the option that does well for both is quite tricky. We have experience with that, of course, but that's the end goal.
Makes sense. Speaking of that experience of working with API references and helping people make these great doc sites,
Yeah.
why did you choose OpenAPI as a source of truth for generating the API reference? Did you ever consider anything else,
Yeah.
or like coming up with something in-house?
Yeah. I actually have a funny story on this. Which is that when we initially started Mintlify and when it became obvious enough that we needed to go and build like these API reference pages, Um, the very first thing that we did was we actually tried to come up with like our own syntax for doing it.
Mm.
So Mintlify uses like we basically use like MDX, so you have all these like native React like components. And so we were like basically trying to almost come up with like this way of like letting you build an API page using these components. And like kind of basically like add the query parameters, add the authorization tables and all that stuff that way. Um, and I think when we did it for the initial few customers, the kind of the reaction was just like why like why like we have open API spec, it works well, it really expresses what we're trying to do already, and it's already like what like we're using to maintain this. Why do I have to do this and that? And so over the course of like the next little bit, we like just got more and more people who are like, let's just make it support for open API. And then we finally got to integrating and supporting the open API. And then eventually also realized that way more people prefer that than the other way around. And so then basically re-architected to have it be open API first. I think the short answer to this is like it is just it's a great standard.
Mhm.
Obviously open API is not perfect, right? It has its many flaws. But nonetheless, as a widely accepted reference and standard for like REST APIs in general, as being a great, thing of, building these automations and having all the support, the community, and for people to really accept it as, I think is this really big accomplishment. And I think it speaks to why it's so widely adopted today.
Yeah, I was smiling all to that because I think my feelings and thoughts on Open API in particular probably warrants a whole another session. But also wanted to give a quick shout out to the Open API initiative, though they are
Yeah.
working on V4, which is supposed to launch by the end of the year. It's meant to be a big improvement on
Yeah.
some of the shortcomings of Open API today. That being said, I completely agree with you. It is a standard. It's widely adopted. The tooling around it has grown immensely. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think companies like Mintlify, Speakeasy, and others have played a huge role in pushing that tooling forward. And the interest has, I think, we're almost seeing like a renaissance in the open API space
Yeah.
after a few years of it kind of going quiet. So
Yeah.
exciting to see what comes next there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. I think it's like it certainly felt like it's had a more of a resurgence. I think more and more companies that we've seen are just using it left and right and asking how to edit it, asking how to to set it up. I think is it's basically everyone who really needs who's building APIs and docs at this point, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I have to ask you one question, and give me the
Yeah.
spiciest take if you want. Where do you think where do you think SDKs fit
Yeah.
into an API strategy? Are they important? Are they not important? What are your feelings on SDKs?
Oh, I think they're incredibly important. I think I personally think that if every company and I mean this not to not to kind of like toot your horn or speakeasies of course, but this is my genuine opinion is that as a developer, I personally think that every API should have an SDK because I think it is much more rich for the development experience. Uh, and than anything else. I think like as even as simple as just like having all of the like the a good
Yeah,
structure of like what the like through an SDK, I think is just like allows the developers to much more easily understand like hey like what are the functionalities of this, what are the typings of this, what are the available methods of this, and I think all of that just makes setting anything up infinitely easier than like trying to just like like piece together, like query params and path params from just like one
yes,
API call. And I hate that, right?
too. Yeah,
I think in every regard, an SDK is better. The only issue is like it's hard for companies to set up an SDK, right? Like it takes a bit of an investment, it takes quite the maintenance, and like I think more importantly, like it needs to be at a stage in which they're confident the SDK is fairly like standardized or the API is fairly standardized so they can go tackle it. But if that's not the case, right? Wink, wink, use Speakeasy. Like, I really do think that it should be much more common than it is.
yeah. I completely agree too. As a company that is very focused on this today, we tell a lot of the customers we work with too to kind of think about using us once they get to some stability with the API spec itself. And I'll honestly say, an SDK that is inaccurate or doesn't work is potentially worse than not having an SDK, right? Because you
Yeah.
can now have two interfaces the customer's debugging,
Yeah.
and it can be pretty opaque as to what's actually failing at the endpoint or the SDK itself. Okay, awesome. Um, Thanks for walking us through all that. So finally, I had kind of two questions.
Yeah.
No conversation today is complete without throwing a little bit of Gen AI spice into the mix. How do you see Gen AI and the overall AI landscape
Yeah.
changing people's expectation around docs? Do you
Yeah.
find that coming up in more conversations? Is it totally tangential? Yeah, and what's your opinion on how this all intersects for Mintlify?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very clear that it's changing the expectations and changing kind of like the paradigm a little bit in terms of what people kind of expect and think about a docs platform for sure. um I think the way that I've looked at this is like there's like a very high level way that I look at this, and then there's like a very like kind of what are users asking for looking at this way, and I think there's a little bit of actually a bit of a difference in terms of what this is. um so as a very high level, I personally see and believe that uh, being very like AI driven is the future of what docs or the underlying problem of like helping developers
Mhm.
understand how to build something is going to be about for sure. I think there's a lot of data points to prove that. Like Stack Overflow is kind of dying, right? Relative to
Yeah,
people just directly asking on, like ChatGPT or, using like these kind of like developer facing understanding products, like Cursor or even Perplexity. I personally don't like think I've used Stack Overflow as like even like a third as much as I used to in the past, right? Um, and so first and foremost, like I think there's an acknowledgement of that. And I think even in like a very high level way, and a little bit of like a theoretical way, I personally believe that when a user really like a developer is trying to figure something out, they really just try want to get to the answer of what they're looking for as quickly as possible.
yeah, totally.
And docs is just kind of like this means to an end in getting that to happen, right? It's almost like kind
Yeah,
of this wall you have to climb a little bit to like, to get to the other side, which is the answer. And I think it's like Gen AI kind of offers like this other approach, this like kind of hole you can just go through instead of trying to
yeah.
climb through this wall of text and like
The
links to get
wormhole.
to the answer. Yeah, exactly, the wormhole, right? For you to just get to the answer directly and it being personalized for you. And I personally have this worldview where like in the future there's going to be less links to docs. It's just going to be like some sort of like chat modal or some sort of interface where it just directly helps you with the answer rather than puts you to this link to a page where you then have to go
Yeah,
read and just to go figure things out. So I personally have that opinion, right? Um, that's the very high level. At a much lower level, I think you also have to acknowledge what's like realistic in terms of what the models and the Gen AI stuff is capable today in terms of achieving that. Um, I think we have benchmarks on this internally, which is that the answers are generally there about like 80 to 90% of the time, right?
yeah,
Which sounds pretty good, um, but is still a bit far off the mark from what can then be considered a reliable solution to get people the answer. Because if you don't really trust the answer is right, like a tenth or a fifth of the time,
yeah,
um, it's just not that great, and you still have to go reference things to make sure that it's right. And the same thing you mentioned about like like an out of date SDK or a wrong SDK is worse than no SDK. I think it's similar in terms of getting people to the answer. Like a
yeah.
hallucination when you're trying to get to the truth is actually very cost like is very costly. Um, and so we augment our product with, AI chat and I think in the upcoming months, a lot more AI features. But we do this with a bit of a cognizant view of like, like that it's still in a stage in which it's not 100% there. And it still needs to be, the user experience almost needs to be tailored in a way to kind of accommodate for that.
Yeah.
I think in the future, again, it will be, but right now it still has some ways to go. And because of that reality, I think users who are using this understands that and they kind of adjust their expectations a little bit to it as well.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, we hear this and we interact with this a lot, and my worldview is as well similar to yours that there's a high level and kind of a day to day user need. at a
Yeah.
high level, I absolutely think like what an API integration is going to evolve, right? Like how someone integrates with an API. Are you going to be using an SDK, a doc side? Are you going to be interacting with an agent to do that integration for you? Like, is definitely going to evolve. But when it comes down to where the industry is and where a lot of customers are, the way we found AI really help is as you said, like help people get fast more quickly to the answer.
Yeah.
In our case, helping customers get more quickly to a high quality integration or a high quality SDK. So we've
Yeah.
been cognizant on where to introduce Gen AI instead of giving it full front and center to the customer and having it hallucinate or exposing them to issues.
Yeah.
We've tailored it to work on the open API spec, which is, a typed interface. It's structured, the outputs can be tested and validated. And so it
Yeah.
helps with something that a lot of people see as like a friction point to getting to a good SDK. But once they
Yeah.
get that, then the experience of building a good SDK comes down to them using our tooling and kind of branding it to match their DevEx expectations. So completely agree
Yeah.
with you. There's a high level and there's like, how is this going to percolate down to our product and the broader ecosystem? I think that's a TBD, and I think we'll be at the forefront of it as it happens.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think it's just like, maybe this is the case for dev tooling, which is that there just is a slightly higher bar for like what like it needs to be in terms of accuracy and reliability for it to
Yeah,
be like really, like something that developers can adopt more mainstream. I also think that at the end of the day, the viewpoint anyone can really have with this is just like, like AI as just like anything is like a new tool in a toolbox, right? There's a time and there's a space for it, you know. It's like I don't even know what tool it would be. It's like this magic wand, right? It's
yeah,
yeah, it's like it's great and all, right? Like, and I'm sure it could unlock a lot of use cases that you couldn't otherwise, but it's like if you're trying to just put a hammer down on a nail,
yeah,
like you don't need necessarily a magic wand to do that sometimes, you know.
yeah.
So it's like it's a thing that unlocks, but it doesn't necessarily need to go and like fundamentally, you know, reinvent if that makes sense. I think as time goes on, we'll see more, uh, but yeah,
Amazing. Well, I think that's all the questions. Han, I wanted to thank you so much for spending this time together, and I'm excited also for all of the partnership efforts that are upcoming with Speakeasy and Mintlify, and looking forward to covering that next time we talk.
yeah, likewise, and thanks for having me. It's been a real treat.
Of course.